You're listening to Spiritual Matters. We're joined now by Eckhart Tolle. Hello, Eckhart. Very good evening. Welcome to the programme.
Hello. Thank you very much.
It's great to have you on with us here.
Thank you.
Now, I want to start by talking about consciousness. And here we are on this beautiful planet. Life could be like a dream. But for very many people, there's a lot of suffering in the world. What is that about?
Well, a large amount of the suffering that humans experience, of course, is actually self-created. If you look at the human history, or just take 20th century history, you'll find that far in excess of 100 million humans, probably as many as 150 million human beings, were killed by other humans. This is just a staggering figure, almost impossible to imagine. And all that suffering, of course, is man-made. And it must originate, if humans create such a reality on their planet, it must originate in a state of consciousness, collective consciousness, that has a strong element of dysfunction in it, because only a dysfunctional state of consciousness could create such insanity that is human history. We are so used to it when we hear these things, but if you look at it objectively, it is almost unbelievable. So I would say then we need to look to the root cause of the suffering that humans inflict on each other, and the suffering they inflict, of course, also on the planet and on nature, and the suffering even that every human being, through dysfunctional use of the mind, inflicts on him or herself. That's another matter that perhaps we'll come to a little bit later.
All right. Now, if we go back to the beginning of time, were people conscious? I mean, originally, was their consciousness there, and it kind of distorted along the way?
Well, there are, in mythology, the mythology of almost all cultures, there are stories of the so-called Golden Age that in the myth of many, many cultures. And in the Golden Age, it is said humans lived in a state of harmony with each other and with the planet, and a state of happiness. In a way, even the story at the beginning of the Bible, the Garden of Eden, is a version of that Golden Age myth. So it is quite possible that humans at a very earlier stage in their development lived in greater connectedness with the transcendent reality, one could say, and with themselves and with each other, and that they gradually lost that. And my feeling is that they gradually lost it because the mind, the ability to think analytically and to interpret the universe conceptually, that over many millennia this ability grew, and so thinking activity became more and more prevalent. And through then, which of course it was on the one hand an enormous step forward in the evolutionary process, but on the other hand, humans lost their connectedness with the source of their very being, and because they became more and more identified with what we could call the noise in the head, the continuous thought processes, which analyze and judge and fundamentally create a sense of separation between yourself and the world out there, between yourself and the other human being, or the other group of human beings, the collective. So I think the loss of inner peace may have happened over a long, long period of time, and the dysfunction grew, but at the same time, the power of the mind also grew. So I think what we have been going through was a necessary evolutionary step, although it looks sometimes like a regressive step, but I don't think it was, because initially I believe humans lived in a state of natural connectedness with the transcendent, with being. They were naturally in a state of peace without even knowing it, because they'd never experienced anything else. And so we had to lose that in order to regain it at a deeper level, because if you lose something and then you regain it, you're then suddenly much more conscious of it, and you can go deeper with it. There's a story in the New Testament, I think, that exemplifies that, and that's the story of what is usually called the prodigal son, which is, I think probably everybody knows it. The son says to the father, "Give me my inheritance, I want to go out and experience the world," and the father reluctantly gives him his inheritance, and the son goes off and squanders it over the years, becomes destitute, becomes a beggar. By the way, the version in the New Testament is only one of many versions of the same story that exists in the Middle East, and the son then, in a slightly different versions of the same story, the son even forgets where he came from. The son sits there begging. He's squandered all his resources, and he lives there abroad in a foreign country. These are all significant symbols. And then the father sends messengers to his son to ask him to come back home. And then as the messengers reach the son, messengers in this are the symbols for, I would say, spiritual teachers. The messengers come to remind the son who he is, and then finally the son begins to remember, and he returns to his father's home, or home country, his own home, and the father immediately loves him deeply, in fact, more deeply than before. And the other son in the story in the New Testament, who hasn't left home, says, why do you seem to love him more than you love me? He says, "Oh, I love you anyway, but this son," says the father, "was lost, and now he's been found again." So the story seems to imply that here the father loves him more deeply. Now, this is not to be, I don't think of God as a father or anything like that, but that's the old terminology, which really means once you regain a lost state, you regain it, but it's not just a regression to that earlier stage of innocent, or you could say innocent, happy childhood of humanity, but it is a regaining of the innocence of the child, but with the added dimension of knowing, of depth. And this is our destiny, and this is really, I would say, what spiritual awakening means for us here now, is to regain what humans probably a very, very long time ago lost, or not really lost, but something that became obscured or covered up through the evolutionary development of the mind. And now there's the possibility, which the earliest spiritual teachers like the Buddha and Jesus, they pointed out to the possibility of living in a different state of consciousness. That really is the basic message of all the great teachers. They just use different words to point to it. Both the Buddha, for example, and Jesus recognized what I mentioned just earlier now, the dysfunction in the human psyche, in the human mind, in the human consciousness. Jesus called it sin, or original sin, and Buddha called it suffering. You are in a state of continuous suffering. And they both realized that there is a way out of that. And the Buddha simply called it the end of suffering, and Jesus called it the possibility of living in the kingdom of heaven, which is not a place that is somewhere else. He very clearly said, it's not over there or over here. You can't see it, as he said literally in the Testament. You cannot see the kingdom of heaven. It does not come with signs to be perceived. So it's not, the kingdom of heaven is not something that comes in the future or is a place that is somewhere else. Kingdom of heaven is clearly a dimension of consciousness, an inner state of consciousness. So he points to the possibility of living in a different state of consciousness and the necessity of seeking that. And that was a necessity then, but it's a much greater necessity now for humans to enter a different state of consciousness, because if we don't, if we carry on in the same state of consciousness that has produced what we call human history, which is a history to a large extent, a history of madness, if we don't change, then we are going to create more and more havoc on the planet and ultimately will bring about our own extinction. It's urgent now that we embrace the new consciousness.
You've been listening to an excerpt from an interview with Eckhart Tolle. To hear this interview in full, visit our website spiritualmatters.org.